the question of whether the corporate culture here, the Mogs, the Delaware Norths, the Riches, and many others, whether they're doing as much as they can to support the local startup companies, I think it's kind of ambiguous. It's hard to say, but I think that probably there's more work that could be done.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever you may be listening, and welcome to Latitude, the 43 North podcast. I'm your host, Nate Benson, Director of Media and Public Relations at 43 North, and I've got a very exciting show for you this week. We have Dan Miner from Buffalo Business First. He covers the tech and startup scene for Business First, and he's been doing so since 2012. So he, more than many people, knows quite a bit of the history of Buffalo's tech resurgence. So it's a great conversation with him today. So I'm not going to waste another minute introing him, and let's get right to this week's conversation with Dan Miner. Well, Dan, how the turntables have turned. How are you?
Good, Nate. How are you?
Good. There's not many who don't know you, but for those of who are living in a box, give us the quick pitch of who you are, what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm a staff writer for Buffalo Business First. I've been there since 2012. And Business First is a business-based publication that covers Western New York, the companies, and the overall economy. And the reason I'm here, I cover a multitude of things, but the reason I'm here is that I pay pretty close attention to the local startup technology scene.
And I've gone full reporter mode on this. I've given you no questions in advance, so you have no idea what I'm about to ambush you with. It's perfect. So life before Business First, what was that like, and what were you doing?
Yeah, I was a local daily newspaper reporter. I started at the Tonawanda News. Rest in peace.
R.I.P. Yeah.
By the way, and made my way to the Gazette, which is more or less the same company, the Niagara Gazette, which covers City of Niagara Falls.
It was just the anniversary of that closing too, the Tonawanda News, like within the last month or so. I saw it in my Time Hop app. I was like, oh gosh, that seems like yesterday. But anyway.
Yeah, that was sad. I mean, I don't know are there people at Tonawanda City Council meetings anymore and planning board meetings?
No.
Yeah, that kind of sucks. I mean, there was things were happening there that deserved public attention.
Oh, absolutely.
So, but what are you going to do? Sign of the times. I went from there to a slightly bigger newspaper in Utica, New York, the Utica Observer-Dispatch. I covered City Hall for 4 years there. And so that brings us pretty much up to the time when I came to Business First in 2012. We were looking at raising a family. My wife and I, we wanted to be back in our sort of native Buffalo region. As we'd found out later, grandparents save lives, so it was a good decision. And I pestered our editor Jeff Wright for a couple of years until he finally relented and hired me at Business First, and the rest is history.
So when you get to Business First, how did the tech startup thing kind of happen? Because Business First, of course, covers a wide variety of all business news. So naturally, tech startups would fall into that. But 2012, not much is happening in Buffalo at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean there was some. I would say the infrastructure for what we might call the resurgence now was being laid, but certainly it was less obvious at that time. I created the startup beat at Business First basically out of my own desire to cover it. It wasn't anything that was in anybody's traditional silo. I mean, there was education, there was small business and whatnot. But so I had been covering the sort of nodes of Rust Belt decline at the Gazette, at the Utica OD, at the Tonawanda News for 8 years. And I really love journalism. I can't imagine myself doing anything else, but I was looking for a new way to to journalistically express the way that I lived. And my first introduction to some of the charter members of the Buffalo startup scene was the Startup Weekend in 2012 at Medaille College. Mm-hmm. I did that on a Friday night as part of my education coverage, and thought, this doesn't feel like a kind of a ho hum event. It feels like there's a legitimate kind of buzz in the air, and I wanted to find out more about what the people they were doing. And that sort of initial interest led me into some of the initial places where people were sort of setting down roots and putting out a shingle that Buffalo startups were here and wanted to be recognized, including the Z80 Labs incubator and some of the people who were involved in that. So
I have to imagine that startup weekend many years ago probably had some of the usual suspects that you see now in somewhat successful startups in Buffalo, right? And names that come to mind, your Dan Magnashevsky's.
That's where I first met Dan. Yep.
Yeah.
I met John Spitz there.
Yep.
I met Brendan Dever. It was looking to start a heads-up display, and I'm sure there were more. I can't really remember at the time, but yeah, that was it was interesting how many people have gone on to do really interesting things out of that initial gathering of people. So
there's obviously been a lot of change in the kind of startup ecosystem. Where do you obviously you triggered back to those startup weekends. And those happen all over the country and all over the world, so they're not necessarily unique to Buffalo. But is there something about Buffalo that you've in your coverage have noticed is unique?
So the Buffalo has its own unique story and its own unique trajectory, and so it's the details that are unique and that are interesting and that ultimately are going to be the seeds of whether this is all very successful or whether it doesn't meet people's expectations. So I think the thing that's happened that's been good in Buffalo is that it's been more than one force that's been that's sort of been created and sustained itself. It's been the grassroots network of entrepreneurs, which has grown through coding meetups and grown through startup weekends and grown by getting people from UB, kids from UB to get interested in the scene or found companies or work for startups. And you could look at that segment and say that it's done something. It's grown more than there's still a lot of work left to be done, but it's grown more than I would have expected initially in 2012 when I first started covering this. And then that segment of people has been met with another, I would say, a very important silo for a startup economy, and that's the existing business class. And I think that's something that's really unique in Buffalo is that startups for business executives and business managers, all in that sort of upper crust business network, have become a hobby. And they've become a subject of gossip at golf clubs and, at the Buffalo Club over lunch. And they compare notes and they make fun of each other when their companies aren't doing as well. And, in this sort of people who are mostly friends or at the very least, know each other are also all very competitive. So the angel community, not just through the Buffalo Angels, but generally speaking, the people who have portfolios are just everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Sure. And I mean, can you imagine that in 2005 that you would just run into some guy who does real estate in Amherst who also is a guarantee that guy is in some company that you also know. And I think that's a really real thing that's happened in Buffalo. I think it's really unique to the startup ecosystem here. And it bodes well for how many strategic investors a lot of these local seeded companies have. And then the third thing, of course, is that your expression of this sitting right in front of me is that the government has gotten involved in a significant way through a couple of vehicles, but most significantly through 43 North. And it's had a lot of effects. I mean, 43 North is a multifaceted organization with different priorities and different initiatives, but its aggregate effect has been to stabilize the momentum that to give it a platform that was already happening here, so that nobody in Buffalo is afraid anymore that the startup ecosystem is going to falter or go away when they wake up in the morning.
Right. It was certainly early on and kind of shaky grounds. You have a couple early successes, but it's they could easily get scooped up and leave.
And people would ask me that question, and I would ask myself that question, whether we'd still be writing about startups in Buffalo in 2014, or was it a fad? And it's very clear that those three forces have all met and created something that is no longer a fad. And the question now, the premise that or I suppose the longstanding inquiry that I have now going forward is less so about whether or not startups can survive in Buffalo, and more about how much breadth or economic development or aggregate just sort of impact can this have? And I think that's an open question. It's something that's really interesting to talk about.
Well, it's probably that question of, is Buffalo going to be like other kind of Midwest second tier cities where they kind of reach a certain level and like that's probably as high as they're going to get, or are they going to have a few of those unicorns that really set them over the top and you could be compared to a larger market ecosystem?
That is the question. Absolutely.
To be continued, right?
Yeah, you could talk about where Buffalo's at right, where it's at right now relative to hitting that kind of next level where you have where you've turned startups into unicorns, into generators of economic activity. Mm-hmm. And there are some, there's absolutely, there are anecdotes there that you could do it here. They did it with Athenex. They're doing it with ACV Auctions. Athenex has, I don't know if it's necessary to summarize these companies. Probably the listeners know what ACV Auctions is, mm-hmm. but they have almost 500 employees now, and there's plenty of sourcing behind the idea that 2019 is going to be a big year with more very newsworthy thresholds for ACV Auction. Athenex is standing up a biopharmaceutical factory in Dunkirk. They've gone public. They've got hundreds of employees at the headquarters down the street here in Buffalo. So if those companies can do it, anybody could do it. But the whole scene is still so small relative to the other industries here. Like tens of thousands, if not more, people work in manufacturing and education and healthcare. And here in the Buffalo startup scene, it's more like a couple thousand.
Yeah.
And that means that when you have something that's so kind of razor thin still, the narrative can change in a day. If you have another company that turns out like ACV Auctions, you've like doubled the number of, relatively speaking, it's this vast relative growth mm-hmm. compared to where you've been, where if you have companies that falter anywhere from a City Dining Cards or Loop mm-hmm. to like Bach USA recently, all of a sudden it looks like emblematic of the challenges of, of the startup companies and leads to this sort of pessimism. Again, like you said, it's a matter of just, I personally believe it's a matter of seeding. It's about it's about volume, mm-hmm. getting as many companies and investors involved as possible, and then letting from the broad economic perspective, letting the percentages work themselves out. If you do enough of these, some of them will take off.
Law of averages is in your favor.
Absolutely.
At some point. You kind of alluded to we're in a space now where we don't think we're going to wake up one morning and all of a sudden this is all gone. But going back to when you're pitching, a particular beat to your editor, was there much convincing? Did you have to lay out hey, this is what I think the next 6 months or 12 months looks like of content and stories for Business First? I want the bandwidth to do this. Or was it, yeah, sure, go ahead. Try it.
No, I don't ask when I want to really do something.
You just do it.
Yeah, there's
reporting 101.
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't ask to. I basically said, Business First. I mean, there are places where they would flag you and sit you down if they didn't think that you were, doing what they thought. Mm-hmm. But Business First, you have a lot of leeway to write what you think is interesting. We're trying to. We're on the web now, so our audience is just like everybody else. Yeah. It's just everybody. But mostly I go into the day trying to deliver actionable pieces of business tidbits to other people who are doing business in Buffalo, who are, who can take that and then help them make money. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the startup coverage has continued to be so robust, is that, like I said earlier, the people who are the traditional Business First readers, the business executives and the managers and the investors and all these people in banks and hospital systems, they're all into this. They want to know who else is making money, and they want to know where the opportunities are. Mm-hmm. And that's how I approach my coverage mostly.
Speaking of the business community, you mentioned earlier how there's kind of the chatter amongst certain circles about the startup scene. Have you noticed, though, there's more of a legitimate business buy-in to established corporations in Buffalo, and there's many big ones, of course, that we all know of, the usual suspects. But, in your reporting, has there been some kind of viable, evidence that the business community is kind of coming in and helping out some of these startups, because that's equally as important as people investing in having those whether it's mentorship or actual business with startups.
Yeah, so I was mostly, when I was talking about the business community, I was talking about individuals.
Yeah,
a lot of whom are associated with these companies. The people, there's people from Riches who are involved, or who invest in companies, and people from Delaware North who invest in companies. But the question of whether the corporate culture here, the Mogs, the Delaware North, the Riches, and many others, whether they're doing as much as they can to support the local startup companies, I think it's kind of ambiguous. It's hard to say, but I think that probably there's more work that could be done to have them really take more chances and pay more attention to these people who are the future of our business community.
Obviously, there's been the success stories like you've mentioned before, the Phoenixes, the ACV auctions. But has there been a story you've been following kind of since the infancy of something that you've just kind of been blown away by the progress, and curious like what's next for that either person, individual, or startup?
Oh boy, that you have to. I don't want to be redundant because like I said, two of the companies that would come to mind I already talked about. So let me.
Or is there an unsung hero? I guess that's a better way of putting it. Is there someone that is just at the cusp of really breaking through, you think?
Well, there's a roster of companies that I have sort of actively monitoring that I think are potential next ups, and I think so from that perspective, I'm closely watching Post-Process Technologies, who you get to the stage where they're starting to attract serious institutional interest, interest from venture arms and stuff like that, and they have what they say is a really innovative product and a legitimate business. Dozens of people working there. It's kind of interesting. I think so. Post-process looks a lot like what people around here are comfortable, synthesizing in their own sort of way of looking at business, because this is an old school blue collar industrial town, and there's a lot of angel investors who've gotten behind that company and helped it grow. Because if people don't know, I sort of neglected to summarize the company. They build machines that clean parts after they've been through additive manufacturing. Currently, a company part gets 3D printed, and people have to literally like clean it with toothpicks. They make machines that do this, and supposedly are very necessary for the next wave of large scale additive manufacturing. So they're growing and selling and looking like a company that could really do a big fundraise, maybe even next year, that would put the would press down the accelerator button on that car and start to give it the same kind of veneer that ACV Auctions has, where all of a sudden you're really in the fast lane. You're really well funded and taking a big swing at it. The other one, you probably know more about these guys than I do, Nate, but is Kangaroo Time. I think that it wasn't especially the first time I heard about this company on a very superficial level. It didn't blow me away. Yeah. Nor did ACV Auctions, so that shows you how much I know.
And that's why you and I aren't millionaires investing in companies.
I've learned there's one thing I've learned, it's that I should not be angel investing. A 43 North winner from 2 years ago, I believe, and are staying in Buffalo. They won some of the 43 North follow-on funding. It's a web-based, basically content management platform for daycares and preschools, right? So also in the midst of a significant fundraise, and also with a pretty significant team that's growing here, and looks like the kind of software company that is in a national race for the market. Yeah. And they're one of the leaders. And if they, this kind of thing is all about market share and about how fast you can grow and how effectively you can grow. And, that means that they've already figured a lot of it out. There's still a lot of hard work to be done, but they could really be, I think they could really be an explosive company. And so I guess that's why Scott to the CEO and founder. That's why I'm pestering you so often, even though you're really busy.
Yes, and of course I'm always pestering Scott too from the internal PR side. I'm like, hey, I know you've got good news. When can we share? He's like, not yet. I'm like, so we're in the same boat.
Indeed.
Trust me. But you've been covering the things so long, and I, the listeners who know my backstory, I covered a similar beat on the TV side for several years, and I would run into, and I'm curious what your feelings are. You, of course, from a journalistic side of things, you're trying to neutrally cover, everything the best you can. But what we're covering, and especially what you're today covering, is very exciting. So it's easy to come across in your reporting that you're just rooting, you're rooting for everybody. Is it difficult to make sure that you're, telling the journalistic side of every story and the good, the bad, and the ugly?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do have to take stock of what the coverage in totality looks like. And so I've kind of, at this point, I've been doing it for a while, and I'm pretty comfortable with where I'm at. I treat most very young companies with kid gloves. Yeah. I'll do your feature story. I'll talk about your raise. I'm not going to blow your company up if you've only got 2 people. And because first of all, I don't even know, again, a lot of the companies that I'm skeptical of are the companies that end up being the most successful. So secondly, this is kind of like my own way of doing this that I've developed. There hits a point, kind of like where post-process is now, and definitely where ACV is, where you don't get, where I ask a little bit more analytical and serious questions. And the coverage rounds into form where you're really doing a more mature business coverage of a company that's got a lot of money and a lot of people involved, and is making a lot of big decisions which are affecting a lot of people. And so I guess the more serious the company becomes, the more serious I get about just being a little more analytical about it.
It's a more data-driven story versus kind of the feel-good.
Yeah, and I mean, so like ACV's at the point right now where they're like a Valley style company. They got lots of venture capital coming in, and they're racing across the country to try to capture as much market share as possible. And there are when you do that, there are questions that can be asked of the company, and certainly there are questions that I haven't done much on ACV recently just because I've been busy with other things, but they're at the point now where they get to have to explain their philosophies, their management philosophies, and their strategies in a way that are expected to be more detailed and more mature. And then the third thing is I try to sort of do systemic coverage of the scene, talking about when there is good news, like there are more venture deals or more activity, something that anecdotal that I've noticed that is, objectively good. And at the same time, when companies aren't doing well, when there's a slowdown, writing that too, so that you really try to look like the bellwether or the arbiter of what is and what isn't going well, the authority, so to speak, on the startup scene. So, I mean, I make lots of mistakes, and it's not always easy to distill simplistic conclusions about the direction of the whole thing. But yeah, I think since there's so much attention on this right now, the goal is to just tell the truth about it to everybody, and hopefully the coverage behind it means that they trust you.
I know you don't. You're probably in a similar situation that I'm in. A father of kids under 5, so there isn't much venturing out of the house. That being said, when you're talking to the general public, obviously work always comes up in pretty much any type of conversation when you're talking to folks. Do you still get those looks like you have 10 heads about covering startups, or what do you mean startup scene in Buffalo? Is there that traction in terms of just broader awareness for kind of Joe everyday, or is it still, do we still have some places we need to go?
I do still get that. Yeah. Surprisingly, I mean, in my business first circles, I never get that.
Right.
When you're dealing with just all the people who are, if you're familiar enough with business first to know me, then you're probably really actively engaged and into Buffalo stories.
It's such a focused target
companies.
audience with business first.
And then, I have friends who are just like everybody else. I have friends who are professionals all over the city who are just because I grew up here. And a lot of times they ask me questions that seem just sort of naive to me, like, what's up with this startup thing?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I've
don't
been
even know how to answer that.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of it. Where do you want me to start? Like,
it goes back to
grab a
19
beer. Yeah. So, and that, so that grounds me a little bit where I'm thinking, okay, like, this is still a silo. And, I think that people are more interested in Buffalo stories than they have been in a long time. The community, I think the biggest thing that's changed in Buffalo is not so much the metrics and the post-recessionary private sector sort of gradual growth, and all that stuff has happened. And I think what's happened is that people are just sort of more hopeful than they used to be. There's an economic theory behind this called the theory of rational expectations, which is that people create in the economy what the conditions that they expect should be created. And I think that's a good way to describe what's happening. So a lot of these people that I'm talking to, I think people want to believe that and they do believe that the living conditions in Buffalo are getting better for most, and that they're ready to latch onto this. What is the startup scene? And I think that, but what they need to see is more evidence. And to that person, all this progress I'm talking about looks very slow and incremental. They want to see some kind of thing that resembles Facebook or Amazon or something like that, or even a bunch of companies maybe that look like ACV instead of just one.
It also helps in terms of just the general mood of the population. The Sabres are on a 6-game winning streak, so that's pretty
I know,
good.
Yeah, the year I dropped my seasons.
Myself and others as well. Yeah. Anyway, when you're obviously you can't compare. You can't ever compare like Buffalo to Boston, New York, or Austin, or Denver, or Silicon Valley, of course. That being said, why should companies in those areas be focused on a market like Buffalo for either moving or even expanding? Because obviously there's benefits to just expanding a company and not having just a West Coast office.
Yeah. So I guess I think that for 43 North, the process that 43 North has gone through offers a lot of insight into that question, because 43 North has found that the companies that it recruits here do a lot better when they have like a purpose here.
Right.
So I think that companies in those regions need to look at Buffalo as a much more affordable and much more accessible market, and a place where you could get a lot more attention for what you're doing if you're doing it well, is in the places where there might be a strategic fit. We have lots of specialty manufacturers. We're a huge logistics hub. It actually boggles my mind that there aren't more hot logistics startups in Buffalo. I mean, we're like, if we can claim anything, it's that a lot of trucks rumble through here with a lot of goods. Yeah. It's just, it seems like it's almost like a dearth of tech here. I don't know I know nothing about the tech logistics industry or whatever, but it just seems like it would make a lot more sense to have there's a big opportunity here for a lot of data and just sort of activity behind that. So Buffalo does healthcare well, and it supports biotech startups. There are mature investors here who will look at your company, and there's a lot of customers here. We have a lot of sick people. Which means we have a lot of healthcare organizations, and we have health tech. We have biotechnology manufacturers on Grand Island. We have Fresenius Kabi. We have Thermo Fisher, now with Phoenix, and even a lot more than that. So there's a lot of, if companies are looking for a more affordable way to get more attention, there are a lot of potential strategic fits for high-tech companies in Buffalo.
Kind of rounding out the conversation, I know, business versus nationwide in markets all across the country. So I have to imagine you probably either follow other colleagues or talk to them about, the same kind of scope of reporting you're doing. And just in your general observations as well, maybe, what are still some of the missing links that, the startup community needs to kind of come together and solve or adapt to or change altogether to, again, get to the next level or that next hurdle, so to speak?
Well, I think when you're talking about the next step in the development of the local of the Buffalo startup economy, part of it is just trusting the cycles, trusting the investment that's been made by private individuals and by the government, and in the theory that it takes 20, 25 years, and we're in year 8 or 9 of, depending on when you started or counting, of trying to build a startup economy here. So a lot of it is really, I wouldn't think so much of it as a relative kind of thing. In generally in Buffalo's economy, I prefer not to think too much about, oh man, Dallas has exploded since the reception, and we only added 20,000 jobs, or to me, who lives here, the only thing that's important is that I'm doing better than I was.
Right.
And I'm not saying I am. I'm just saying that's the most important metric by which I prefer to define it. And this is why, bringing this back to your question, even though on a day-to-day level it can feel very incremental and slow how startups are growing here, there's more deals, there's more activity, there's more companies, and we've gotten a couple of hits. And the key is to just keep bringing more local talent and more local energy in, and trusting the ratios, and more of that will happen, and it'll beget even more activity as long as everybody keeps plowing and keeps the belief. The one thing, the corporate communities in other places are a lot more aggressively buyed in. I think, like thinking about Baltimore or Portland, these are different cities. They're very distinct economies from Buffalo, and what's happening there is not directly analogous, but a lot of the local big companies are active in sponsorships, and it's not like they're totally disengaged, but they're not taking ownership of it in a way that they could, So I probably named more names than I should have earlier, but this could be somebody's thing. You could start a accelerator, or start a fund, or start a more significant, heavily branded program. These are things that are being done all across the country, and Buffalo doesn't have as visible amount of that as I think maybe happens in other places. So I don't know how you get through those people, but it hasn't happened in as much volume here as it is in other places.
Well, Dan, I appreciate you coming on the podcast today, especially a week of a holiday. For those who want to connect with you, what's the best way to do so?
Yeah, if you search for it, I have a LinkedIn account. It's really the place where I most actively promote my work, especially focusing specifically on the entrepreneurs and the investors that I write about. I'm sure to name check them, link to my stories, and give links to their LinkedIn bios as a way to really introduce you to who I'm writing about and why. So that has been the most effective way to do it for me. And if you really want to, interact with me on social media, LinkedIn is the best way.
All right. Any sneak peek of any big stories coming up that we should be aware of?
I kind of referred to it earlier, but I'm doing a broader story about Buffalo and the theory of rational expectations, because I've been in the middle of this grand debate about whether things are really going better in Buffalo or whether it's all just a bunch of marketing hooey, and I think that so you ask yourself, what has changed? What is the significance of Larkinville or Canal Side or the medical campus if, broadly speaking, there hasn't been massive population change, there hasn't been massive job growth, there hasn't been massive new investment? What's the value of all these reshuffling of assets? All this sort of breath of coolness, the breweries and stuff that have come through. And I think that applying this metric, this idea that people simply, as a community, we've long been used to being pessimistic about Buffalo. I grew up in that era.
Yeah.
It feels like home to me to talk to somebody who's like that. But that's not how people here think anymore. And psychology is very important to an economy. And so that communal change in psychology has simply expecting good things to happen has led to good things being, and the fact that it remains the sort of status quo of how we think about Buffalo. There's a lot of corny, cliche things that people branding like Buffalo Love and stuff like that, but it is speak to something real that's happening, that there's a reasonable analysis to be done. The Buffalo is actually different, and that it's going to be even more different with more cool stuff as long as it keeps believing in itself. So it's coming up.
It's kind of the age-old anecdote, like, how do I be happy? Well, just be happy.
Indeed.
And things will happen.
It's like consumer confidence.
Dan, thanks for coming on the podcast. We'll check in with you down the road.
Thanks, Nate.
Cheers. I want to thank Dan for joining me on the show this week. I thought it provided great context for some of the things that were happening in the Buffalo startup ecosystem in the early days, what's happening now, and what might be happening in the future. And again, you can head on over to LinkedIn and find Dan Miner from Business First and connect with him there. Thank you so much to all those folks who listen to the show on a weekly basis. I've noticed our audience has been growing exponentially for the last several months. A lot of new listeners. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you shoot me an email, podcast@43north.org, and let me know who you want to hear, what topics you want me to talk about, or anything else, any other feedback you might have for this show, and I'm happy to put it under consideration. Head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review of this show, and make sure you share it with your friends or other colleagues at your startup, and that way more people know what's happening in the Queen City startup scene. For 43 North, I'm Nate Benson. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving if you're listening before and or after that. Hopefully you had a good Thanksgiving. For 43 North, I'm Nate Benson. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you at the next one.